All right. So again, starting uh, from the point that we were left off, if y'all remember, last time we are talking about the birth of the Roman Empire. Now, again, remember this transition from republic to empire is a very um, long one. Remember when Augustus Caesar became this kind of this most important position within the empire, you know, the Senate was still functioning, the consuls were still doing their job. As a matter of fact, the consuls, the Senate, most of the Republican apparatus is still in existence even during the time of Claudius Nero, et cetera, et cetera. And so that never really goes away. So again, we have to understand that these are not complete autocrats where they have complete and total authority. They still have a Senate and other people to answer to. Now, as I said, the line of what we call the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which starts with Caesar Augustus and ends with Nero's suicide in 68 CE, pretty much marks the end of that particular line. And you begin to see, immediately following Nero's death, you have a period of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors, which lasts from 69 to 70 CE. Now, it's called that because four particular individuals all claimed the throne at one point in time, and all four of them, well, the first three, eventually met a very brutal and violent death. Now, eventually, one of these competing generals who aspired to become emperor did so, and eventually Vespasian eventually becomes emperor in 69 CE, beginning a new particular dynasty known as the Flavian dynasty. Now, this name Flavian comes from the family name of Vespasian that will exist until his grandson Domitian dies in 96 CE. Now, this particular period in time is actually relatively stable. All right, Vespasian, despite winning the throne via civil war, along with his son and his grandson Domitian, all enter into a piece of prosperity and relative stability during this period of time. Now, it's also during this period of time you begin to see the construction of the Colosseum, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So again, it is a relative a period of peace and prosperity. Now, it is after the Flavian dynasty ends that you begin to see the era of what is known as the Five Good Emperors. Now, I'm not going to make you remember them with the exception of one, which is Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius may be my favorite Roman emperor of all time. Now, most people who are familiar with this name are familiar with him in the Gladiator movie. He is the old emperor in the beginning of the movie that is suffocated, murdered by his son Commodus. That's not really how he died, by the way. I hate to ruin that for you. He actually died as a relatively old man. Now, the reason why I like him so much is he actually spent most of his time writing books and stuff about philosophy. Now, one of the things that I want to recommend to you during this time that, you know, a lot of us are doing nothing is a book written by him that talks about just kind of his advice for living a good, virtuous life. And the book is called Meditations. Everyone can see what I'm typing here? Yeah. So it's a very small book. It's maybe 175 pages at the most, but it just basically gives kind of advice and his own philosophies on how to live a life, and it's actually pretty resonant even to this day. And so you can find it pretty much anywhere online, and usually for free. I'll actually post up a link to it if I can find it. Yeah, so it's actually really good. So I would really recommend it. It's a very simple, easy read, and it's not like you got anything else going on at this point in time. So go check it out, and I'll post a link up later on today on Blackboard. Now, during this period of time, again, aside from Marcus Aurelius's philosophy, you do begin to see this, again, this period of increased Roman stability, economic prosperity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this period in time of Roman history, this period of time of stability, of relative peace, of economic prosperity is known as the Pax Romana. which literally in Latin means the Roman peace. Now, again, this refers to this period in time where Rome literally this is kind of the golden era of Roman history, where you see Rome kind of becoming this, this major powerhouse during this period in time. Now, again, I'm messing up here. This thing. There we go. Now, during this period of time, you begin to see long distance trade connections being formed with nations as far as China, who we'll talk about in a later chapter. Right, so you begin to see relatively stable trading networks over long periods of long distances between India, China, sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, the provinces become what are basically what we call hyper-focused economies. What this means is, for example, that there are particular areas of the empire, for example, Egypt, Syria here, on the Syria here, other areas of the empire which begin producing so much grain, so much food, Egypt in particular, that all of a sudden other regions like Gaul, what is now France, or Hispania, which is now Spain, they can focus on building other things, or focus on growing other things, particularly things like grapes or other what we call cash crops. And so you begin to see provincial focuses of the economy, where all of a sudden now Egypt can provide enough grain and send it through other parts of the empire that other parts of the empire can now focus on growing grapes for wine or growing olives for olive oil. Right. And so again, all of this kind of ties into this greater imperial economic system. Now, the empire was kind of essentially bound together by two particular concepts. The first one is the concept of the law. The Roman law itself was incredibly harsh in regard to its punishments, in regard to its severity. But we also understand that the law code during this period in time was also incredibly flexible. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, the law itself provided for a contract. Now, I'll just give you an example just off the top of my head. Let's say that you hire a carpenter to build you a cabinet, and you come to an agreement, a contract may be signed, and this carpenter works on this thing for you. But then after it's done, you see it, and it is, for lack of a better phrase, a horrible cabinet. It's just nails sticking out everywhere. It looks rusty. It looks like it can give you tetanus. And I'm going to ask this to the class, as dumb as this question seems, should you pay for this crappy cabinet? Okay, but what about, Jonathan? You're in the wrong class. You should have taken a philosophy class for that matter. Very good. I mean, obviously that is the kind of the common knowledge of this, or in other words, that yes, you wouldn't pay for something that's a piece of crap, but you could also make the argument, can't you, that you paid for a cabinet, or at least you agreed that this carpenter would build you a cabinet. It didn't say it had to be a good one, right? So this becomes obviously this becomes a very a very, again, philosophical concept, where all of a sudden, these contracts, what exactly does this mean? Rome, just like the United States today, essentially makes exceptions for this. Yes, it never stated that it had to be a good one, but there is a level of expectation. And so this is why much of our law system today is based on Roman concepts of law. For example, the honoring of contracts was incredibly important in the Roman legal system, and so much like it is today. And even then, despite the fact that, again, the word of a contract is the bond, there are understandings that, for example, if you enter into a contract with someone, you are entering into the understanding that you will do the best job, whether it's building a cabinet, or going to a restaurant and ordering a meal. Now, Aside from that, you also have the foundation of marriage, right? Marriage, even in the pre-Christian or after Christian era, is an incredibly important foundation of Roman society, right? Why? Because again, remember, the job of Roman women is to produce children. And remember, because of the purpose, for two purposes: A, to again provide soldiers for the Roman military, but also provide a stable, consistent workforce. And so marriage was seen as the foundation of this purpose, so that you begin to see it becoming incredibly emphasized during this period in time. Now, obviously, after centuries of Roman rule, you begin to see what we call Romanization, where all of a sudden now Roman culture, Roman language, Roman dress, Roman society, these aspects begin to feel much. If you all remember, um, if you all remember our previous conversation about um, yeah, if you remember our previous conversation about the Hellenization of Alexander the Great's former empire, we begin to see the Greeks kind of the Greek culture and Greek language kind of spread throughout the empire that Alexander the Great created. This pretty much happens the same way, where you begin to see this Romanization. And an example of this is what happens in Spain, all right, what is now Spain, where the language, the language will remain the foundation of what will become the Spanish language later on, where the majority, even in languages like, for example, French or Romanian, you begin to see that foundation of the languages is based in Latin, right? And so again, you begin to see the spreading of Roman culture, Roman ways of life throughout the various parts of the empire. Now, I do want to talk about kind of the later parts of the Roman Empire. Now, after Marcus Aurelius's death, you have a series of very yes, very good, Aaron. That's why they're called the Romance languages, based off of the Roman Latin. You see a long series of issues, all right, beginning with the incompetence of Commodus. Now, just to give you a very brief kind of summary of Commodus, if you all remember from the movie Gladiator, and again, I'm going to spoil this movie for you, if those of you who haven't seen it, but come on, it's been like 20 years already. If you're going to watch it, you need to watch it. But anyway, Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, and he did not kill his father, but he became emperor after Commodus's death. I'm sorry, after Aurelius's death anyway. Now, Commodus himself was more interested in fighting. Now, the movie did get something right, where Commodus actually holds the record for the most victories in gladiator matches. Right? Commodus fancied himself a warrior, and he oftentimes fought in the gladiator ring. But what they did get right in the movie is that oftentimes his opponents were oftentimes tortured before their match with Commodus, so they'd make it easier for him to win. They would often be blinded, they would be beaten, they would have arms and legs severed, so that way to make sure that Commodus would actually win. Now, eventually, a conspiracy, much like you see oftentimes in previous emperors, a conspiracy forms around his assassination, and they're able to actually pay off one of his lovers. At the time, again, this lover was a Greek male wrestler who Commodus fell in love with. Again, at the time, this concept of homosexuality is nowhere as taboo as it will become later on in Christian society. And a group of conspirators were able to pay his lover to strangle him while Commodus slept. Now, Commodus is Joaquin Phoenix's role. The other one, Russell Crowe's character, is made up. Now, so after that aside, and again, I'm just trying to do that. I was just trying to ruin that movie for you. After Aurelius's death, you begin to see major crises within the Roman Empire, and one of these is, or one of the major issues, is that of debasement. Now, the Romans had adopted a currency economy. In other words, they would pay, again, just like today, Instead of a barter economy where I will trade you this pig for these 4 chickens, instead you have currency, usually based off of copper or gold coins, depending. Now, what happens is during this period of time, you begin to see a shortage of currency, where all of a sudden there's not enough coins to go around. Now, the problem at the same time is that the reason why there's not enough coin going around is because you just really don't have you really don't have enough mineral wealth go around. So what they did instead is take coins and literally cut them. In other words, just imagine like a quarter, and using a pair of pliers or whatever, you would actually cut the coin itself. Or even then, if you are if you, let's say, for example, you have existing, you do have some minerals or metals to make coins with, oftentimes what you would have are copper coins being mixed with nickel or zinc. And so this is debasement. This is debasing your coins. Now, yes, you are expanding your currency system, but at the same time, just like Aaron pointed out very astutely, it causes inflation. Right, so this is a very short temporary fix. This is only something, debasement, before the birth of paper currency was a pretty common thing. And if you use it right, it can buy you some time, but at the end of the day, you're supposed to have a solution at the end of it. The Romans never did. And so debasement always became a major crisis, causing massive amounts of inflation. Very good. Now, the other problem with Rome is that even at the time of Augustus, there was never a solid plan of succession. Now, in other words, don't think of this as a situation where an emperor dies and immediately his son becomes emperor. That's not how this works in Rome. Pretty much, once an emperor dies, oftentimes that throne is up for grabs. And unfortunately, most of the competing people wanting to become emperor are generals. So when you have generals wanting to become emperor, oftentimes that they bring in their armies, which leads to civil war. And so unfortunately, these constant fights for power resulted in very violent, very expensive, very costly civil wars, which again drained the empire of resources and manpower. Now, this is also a time when what we'll call Germanic invaders. You begin to see these nomadic tribes in what is now the borders of the empire here in Germany, what is now the Netherlands, Romania, what is now, I guess, what you would call Central and Eastern Europe, becoming more and more problematic. Now, the Romans have been dealing with these nomadic tribes forever. And for the most part, the Romans had relatively peaceful coexistences with them. Yeah, every once in a while they would raid Roman settlements and their villages, but for the most part, these were oftentimes very peaceful and very economically beneficial contacts. But I wouldn't necessarily say they were always a problem. I would say that they were always there. Like I said, sometimes they would raid Roman settlements, but for the most part, they would try to engage in relationships with them, mostly economic relationships. Now, what happened starting in the 3rd century is you begin to see the Germanic tribes becoming more aggressive, all of a sudden entering into the empire and basically trying to claim parts of the empire for themselves. Now, the Romans at the time were strong enough to essentially say, no, you got to leave. But then you begin to see the Roman Empire during this period of instability basically strike up a deal with these barbarians, for lack of a better phrase. Basically, the deal is, we'll let you settle in an area. You still answer to us, all right? But you do essentially, you have to serve in our military. And so this was the deal that was made with many of the Germanic tribes. Basically, you move into the empire, you become semi-Romans, but then you also have to serve in the Roman military. The concept of Germania itself is one that is very vague, Aaron. It's not, that's what the Romans refer to it as. But remember, keep in mind that there is no Germany at this time. It is just a bunch of nomadic tribes living with each other. So yes, that's what the Romans call the region, but there is no actual government of Germany. There is no nation of Germany, if that makes sense. Now, so again, you do begin to see them being problematic. Now, as we'll discuss in a little bit, we will discover that these Germanic tribes are not just showing up at the Roman border just because they want to, right? They are being pushed by something. They're being pushed westward towards the Roman Empire by something substantially problematic. And we'll talk about that later on. Now, by 285, it becomes very obvious that the Roman Empire is facing a major crisis. And all of a sudden now there is an issue of how to actually manage just such a large empire. If you think about it, this is a massive empire that stretches from the borders of what is now Scotland, all the way down to what is now Morocco, all the way down to what is now Saudi Arabia, all the way down, all the way up into what is now modern day Russia. And so this is a massive empire that we're talking about, and with a very small bureaucracy. And so it became very, very apparent to everyone at the time that the empire, quite frankly, is just too large. And so Diocletian, the Roman emperor at the time, begins a new plan. This plan is essentially to carve up the empire into halves. Now, if you notice on the map here, if you look at the Mediterranean, you can see this line that's right next to the boot of Italy that goes all the way down to the North African coast. So Diocletian carves his empire into two: the eastern half and a western half. The eastern half would be based in the city. Now, I know it's difficult to read here, and I will annotate this for you to make it better, at least a little easier to read. The new capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire is known as Byzantium, but it will later be called Constantinople. This thing is, yes, thank you, Aaron. Constantinople. So Constantinople or Byzantium was actually a small fishing village. And the reason why Diocletian actually picked it is because he actually would vacation there and he fell in love with it. And so that would become it. Now, despite it being a small fishing village, within 50 years of becoming the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, it would be a major metropolitan area. So, forgive me. Now, the western half would still remain in Rome. Now, aside from that, aside from carving into two halves, you have the formation of what is known as a tetrarchy. Now, how this works is that each half of the Roman Empire would have an emperor. There'd be a Western Roman emperor and an Eastern Roman emperor. Now, aside from that, you would also have co-emperors. All right, so each, yes, that's very good. So it was originally called Byzantium, but it will be changed to Constantinople for Constantine. But we'll talk about that later. So each co-emperor, or each emperor, the eastern half and the western half, would have a co-emperor. Now, this co-emperor has no official duties. They have no power. They're just there. Their only reason to exist is that in case the emperor dies, the co-emperor steps up and becomes emperor. So this was finally, after what, 290 years, you finally have a solution to secession. You finally have a solution to who becomes emperor after the emperor dies, right? So just to review, technically, how many emperors are there in this new partition? Can anyone tell me? 4, right? There are 4. There are 2 co-emperors, an Eastern emperor and a Western emperor, and then there are 2 co-emperors. But remember, now I want to mention something else very important, is that the Western emperor still holds supremacy over the Eastern one. So it doesn't create 2 particular governments. It just basically kind of makes it easier to delegate authority, all right, from one to the other. Right now, so again, what this means is, of course, is that again, the Western emperor is still the dominant political figure. Now, despite this particular shift, despite this particular movement, nevertheless, this only lasted. Yes, so the Western Emperor remained the dominant figure in Roman politics. So despite this, eventually, when Diocletian dies, his two sons, who were now the Eastern and Western Roman emperors, started going at it. In other words, they started fighting over who actually becomes emperor. So Diocletian's plan goes out the window. Now, eventually, one of his sons, Constantine, becomes the emperor and unifies the empire once again, at least for a brief period in time. Now, we'll talk about the birth of Christianity towards the end of this particular lecture series. But at this point in time, Christianity becomes more and more popular, especially among the commoners of Rome. Right? And so by the time that Constantine becomes emperor, Christianity is the dominant religion in the empire. All right. Now, there are persecutions, there are periods of, but this is very periodic. In other words, I'm sure all of you have heard stories of Christians being fed to lions and things like that, and that did happen. But I want to make it very clear that usually the persecution of Christians in the empire only happened in times of high anxiety. When the economy wasn't doing well, when food was hard to find, when the empire was losing battles, people always look for scapegoats. People always look for someone to blame, right? Even today, if you look at the news, with this whole crisis going around, people are always looking for someone to blame. It's the Chinese's fault, or it's foreigners' fault, or, it's the Democrats or the Republicans' fault. And so it's a pretty common human reaction where we like to blame, we want someone to blame, even if it's, not really something that's blamable. Nevertheless, Christians were a pretty easy target because, well, to non-Christian Romans, they're a bunch of weirdos. They sit around and they pretend to eat the flesh of their savior. It's a pretty weird religion to outsiders. And so, despite the fact that you have periodic persecutions of Christians, Christianity does become incredibly popular. We'll explain why when we talk about Christianity towards the end of this chapter. Now, Constantine, again, seizing on the popularity of Christianity, eventually allows for the free worship of religion in the empire. And so, again, Constantine allows for the free religion. Now, again, it doesn't make Christianity Christianity the official religion. That doesn't come until later. All this does is pretty much allow Christians to worship freely in the empire, when at one point in time they were not. Now, it's important to note that Constantine himself does not become Christian. As a matter of fact, he only becomes Christian on his deathbed, when, quite frankly, he was in a coma. But nevertheless, Constantine, one of his goals is not only to make Christianity a free religion to practice, but to organize it. Again, one of the things that we'll talk about in a moment is that Christianity at this point in time is incredibly fractured. You have different people believing different things. And again, it starts with Jesus himself. Was Jesus man? Was he God? Was he half? Was he what was he? And we talked about this toward the end of the class, is that there are different interpretations of what Jesus actually is. And so, wanting to basically create a universal church, yes, now Jesus, as far as we can tell, existed. Now, what the basis or what his life is, we don't know. All we know is that he was a traveling preacher in the Roman province of Judea, and eventually was executed by Roman authorities. We know that much. Aside from that, we have no idea. Now, let's say, historically speaking, all right, again, if you believe that Jesus was the Son of God and part of the Holy Trinity, and that he walked on water, that is an issue of faith. And I'm certainly not going to question that, or to bring that into question. All right, again, those are issues of faith, which, in regard to actual historicity, we actually can't discuss. Now, one of the things that the Romans actually did in this process, or at least Constantine did, was call a council of bishops. So bishops throughout the empire were called to the city of Nicaea, which is located here outside of Byzantium, outside of Constantinople. And pretty much they were told to come up with basically a consensus version of Christianity, right? And they did. The first books of what we now call the New Testament were incorporated. And again, just FYI, the New Testament that we see today in Bibles is one that was basically compiled, was edited by this council. There are many other books out there that were not included into this New Testament. All right. So again, the what we call the New Testament today was not. It was created hundreds of years after the death of Jesus Christ. Now, one of the other things that was created during this period of time is, yes, very good. So what we now call today the New Testament was created by the Council of Nicaea, is the development of, yes, no, Testament and again, you're going to make me spell. The last things that the council did itself was well, I'll talk about that when we talk. You bring up a good point, Hector, but we'll talk about that when we actually talk about Christianity in just a bit. This issue of the Nicene Creed. Again, for those of you who are familiar with the Nicene Creed is basically the belief in one God, the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so now you have a universal concept where, right, again, Jesus is the Son of God and he's part of a Trinity, right? And so you essentially have this kind of formation of what we now call today modern Christianity. More specifically, you have the formation of what is basically what we now call today Roman Catholicism, but we'll talk about that later. Now, as the Roman Empire is developing this monotheistic religion, in Persia, if you all remember, you have, so let's just kind of go over the kind of the brief history, just to kind of run down. You had the Achaemenid dynasty of Cyrus, of Darius, of the Xerxes. Eventually, they're destroyed by the Greeks. All right, and then you also have the development of the Parthians. Remember, the Parthians, the kind of the cousins of the Roman Empire. Oh, I'm sorry, the Persians. They take over for a brief period in time, but then now you have the Sassanids. Now, the Sassanids are Persian. They are actually ethnically Persian, and they hope to revive the greatness of the old Persian Empire. So think of it like the Achaemenid dynasty, the Empire of Cyrus version 2.0. Now, one of the things that they try to emphasize is the revival of Zoroastrianism. Now, remember, if this, and we'll talk about it in just a minute here, Zoroastrianism. The empire itself, again, so the state religion of the Persian Empire became Zoroastrianism. And so one of the things that one of the Persian Shahanshahs, if you remember the title, what does Shahanshah mean? Very good, King of Kings. So the Persian Shahanshah at the time, Shapur II, actually for the first time ever in Persian history, Zoroastrian history, actually has the sacred hymns of Zoroastrian. Now, if you all remember, Zoroastrianism was passed down from priest to priest. Their hymns, their sacred language, so nothing was written down. And then finally, after 3,000 years, maybe, you finally have this written down in the Yasht. If y'all look here at the bottom, this term Yasht refers to the written text of Zoroastrianism. Think of it kind of like the Zoroastrian version of the Bible, right? And so, again, this Yasht was finally written down in text, and so Zoroastrianism finally has a sacred text. Now, a lot has been analyzed about why you have these large, yes, in very small forms, why you have the adoption of monotheism throughout many parts of the empire. And this is just an example. So you begin to see other empires adopting monotheism. And a lot of research has been done as to why do you have that connection between monotheism and large empires. And the the thought is, or at least the conclusion is that these large empires adopted monotheism in one form or another. This belief in one God, whether it's a God in Rome, or Ahura Mazda in Persia, or even the Buddha, which technically isn't, but we'll talk about that in the next chapter. It's because you basically have the following of one particular ruler. Jonathan, you're kind of right in this, is that it facilitates imperial rule, right? And so it just makes things easier. It kind of makes the transition into imperial rule that much more, let's say, less difficult. Now, so let us talk about this. Now, if y'all remember, we were discussing that the empire itself was constantly under pressure by these Germanic tribes who began pushing further into the empire. Now, remember, as I mentioned before, is that it's, yes, Jonathan. It's, so in other words, the belief in a single monotheistic deity makes it easier to facilitate imperial control, right? There's not that many gods, and it's very difficult to keep up with a polytheistic religion. With this, you have a uniform, standard monotheistic religion, which again, all of a sudden, you also begin to see the incorporation of texts and beliefs about how important it is to follow the rulers of government. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Germanic tribes that were living within the frontiers of the empire, the Romans began noticing that there are more and more of them. In other words, that there are more and more of these Germanic tribes showing up, but they're not looking to declare war. They look like they're running from something. And what they're running from is a nomadic group of peoples that make their home in what is now modern-day Russia, known as the Avars. Now, the Avars are, again, this pastoral group of peoples depend on their horses and their horses and their herds to maintain their way of life. Now, the Avars are also very, very good warriors. And so they begin pushing westward, which of course causes the Germanic tribes that have been living in this region to push westward as well. But then it turns out that the Avars, despite them being ferocious warriors, despite them being, this very impressive group of pastoral warriors, they're being pushed by something else, right? And this is where the Huns come in. Now, the Huns are another pastoral group of peoples who come from what we believe is what is now north of China, right? As a matter of fact, we now can conclude that the Huns are kind of the ancestors to what we'll later call the Mongols. So these Huns, for whatever reason, mostly because of environmental reasons, this is a period of general cooling at this period of time. They can no longer feed their herds at this period at their traditional homeland, and so they begin pushing westward, looking for more grasslands to feed their herds. And so these Huns, again, they're not united. They divide themselves by clans, and so, but nevertheless, they push westward, defeat the Avars. The Avars then move westward, which causes the Germanic tribes to move westward. And so eventually, the Huns, after maybe hundreds of years of traveling westward, make their way into Europe, right? And they begin wreaking havoc on the empire itself. Now, the reason why, the Huns themselves, like I said before, they're formidable warriors, but what makes them even more formidable is that they're eventually unified under one rule led by Attila. Now, Attila was the son of one of the main chiefs of one of the larger Hunnic tribes. Now, eventually the Romans reach a deal with the Huns, basically paying them off. In other words, we will pay you if you leave us alone. Now, in exchange for insurance, in other words, as a method to ensure that the Huns abide by this deal, in other words, that they don't just take the money and keep attacking, they send very important hostages. They send VIPs as hostages to the Romans to ensure that the Huns will abide by this deal. And one of these hostages is Attila. again, son of an important chief. So he spends about 12 years as a Roman hostage. Now he's treated very, very well. He's given an education. He even serves in the military, in the Roman military. But eventually, after X amount of time, he goes home and he takes all these things he's learned of governance, of military strategy, et cetera, and basically begins crushing his opponents, his rivals within the other Hunnic tribes, and pretty much forms this new Hunnic empire under him. And so all of a sudden, this Hunnic empire becomes this unstoppable war machine. Now, how eventually Attila, kind of comes to an end is that Attila will eventually launch a campaign into Italy and marches straight to Rome. Now, supposedly, Attila is, according to legend, Attila is stopped by the Bishop of Rome, who will later become known as a Pope. The Bishop of Rome meets with him, kind of basically talks Attila into avoiding attacking Rome. Now, in many ways, yes, he did. Rome inadvertently created a monster. Now, Attila is basically paid off to leave Rome alone. And one of the, and aside from money, one of the things he gets is a group of women for him to marry. Now, one particular woman, he falls in love with right away. It's the daughter of this important senator, and he marries her. Now, supposedly, what happens in this wedding ceremony, which is located in northern Italy, so Attila marries this woman, and he gets blindingly drunk, like really, really drunk. And he takes his new bride into the room, and he passes out. He passes out kind of on his back, with his head hanging off the bed. Does that make sense? So Attila, he is subject to chronic nosebleeds. And eventually he actually gets one while he's blacked out drunk. And so remember, keep in mind that his head is off the bed. And so he's basically upside down. And he basically chokes on his own blood. And the story goes that, well, he actually didn't bleed out, he actually choked. And so what happens is that, his wife wakes up in the morning and tries to wake him up. And supposedly that, when she lifts him up off the bed, like just this flood of blood just pours out the bed. She starts screaming. The guards who are watching over his bedroom, they break in and find her covered in blood. They find him covered in blood. And as an inherent reaction, they end up killing this poor girl because they thought that she had murdered him. So yeah, that was how Attila died. Now, despite the collapse of, despite the death of Attila, now what happens after the Huns after that? After Attila dies, pretty much it falls into civil war, and the Huns actually literally disappear from the record. No one really knows what happened or what happens to the Huns after this. We assume that many of them just packed up their stuff and headed back east, but we really don't know. Despite the Hunnic threat being gone, the Roman Empire in the West in particular has already collapsed, because of these Germanic invasions, because of incompetence. Now, keep in mind that early historians, when they were writing about the history of Rome, would oftentimes immediately point to the Germanic peoples, like the Vandals, like the Alans, like the Burgundians, like the Visigoths, like the Goths. That's not that, yes, that was problematic, but the Roman Empire faced major crises aside from that. All right. So again, I want to make it very clear that the Germanic invasions are a symptom of a dying empire, not the cause of it. Okay. Now, again, because of all this stuff, you eventually begin to see the Roman Empire collapse. And in 476 CE, the last Roman emperor, a boy who was 15 years old at the time, Romulus Augustulus, is eventually overthrown, and that's it. The western half of the empire dies. Now, it's important to note that it is the eastern half of the Roman Empire that still survives, but the western half in 476 CE no longer exists. All right, so now it is just the eastern half. So it was first the Avars, and then the Huns. Now, the eastern half of the empire, again, as I mentioned before, continues to exist. Now, it's important to note that this empire is known as by another name, what is known as the Byzantine. You will see this a lot, but it's important to note that the eastern half, Eastern Roman Empire, is the same thing. All right, and we just call it the Byzantine Empire to differentiate it from the old Roman Empire. Right. But again, it's pretty much the same thing. So if you hear me say the East Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, I just want you to know that they're the exact same thing. All right. But again, as far as the Romans are concerned, as far as the people of the East Roman Empire are concerned, they are Roman. They are the successors to the Roman Empire. Now, the East Roman Empire, after the collapse of the West, continues to eke out a living. They're barely making it because, remember, keep in mind, they're in a very dangerous position too. Not only did they still have to fight off the various, Germanic tribes like the Goths and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and all these other Germanic tribes, but they also have to fight off things like, for example, the Sassanids here on their eastern frontier. And so, despite this, right, they enter into a period of relative stability and prosperity under the leadership of Justinian the Great. Now, Justinian the Great again becomes emperor, and he is a very effective one. Right now, one of the things he does, well, I'm sorry, Jonathan. Who occupied what? Do I have a map here? No, I don't. Oh, so it's basically the old East Roman Empire, and I'll show you here. If you see in the map here, the line in the middle of the Mediterranean to the right of that is the East Roman Empire. Now, one of the things, well, there's actually three things I need you to remember why Justinian the Great is called Justinian the Great. And the first thing is the formation of the law code. Now, the Roman imperial law code had not changed. All right. In other words, the Roman imperial law code was the same when the First Republic was established hundreds of years ago. A law code that doesn't change, over hundreds of years is very ineffective, needless to say, because times change, new technologies are invented, things happen. And so Justinian, for the first time in hundreds of years, reforms the law code, right? And so the Justinian Code is basically the re-edited version of the Roman law code. It brings it up to date in many ways. And so, again, the Justinian Code is the kind of re-updated version of this after hundreds of years of having the same old one. Now, in addition, you also have the rebuilding of Constantinople. And actually, this is actually what Aaron is referring to here about Justinian. Now, Justinian's wife should be mentioned along with him because she is incredibly important. Now, just a little background on Theodora. So Theodora was Justinian's wife, but she is not of noble birth. In other words, she wasn't the daughter of some, Roman noble or whatever. She was, I guess, what you would call an entertainer, a dancer. That's the best way I can put it. And that's how he met her. Now, despite not being of noble birth and despite not being, educated, she is incredibly intelligent and she is incredibly ambitious. And what Aaron is referring to is a period in time during Justinian's reign known as the Nika riots. And it is during these riots, so Justinian, in order to pay for these projects, which I'll talk about in a minute, he begins raising taxes. And of course, the people of Constantinople don't really appreciate that. And they begin to riot and burn most of the city. Now, according to this story, Justinian was basically the mind of, well, yeah, this whole emperor thing isn't working out. Let's just pack our bags and get the hell out of here. Um, his wife was not of that opinion. Supposedly, she told Justinian, if we're going to die, we're going to die like emperor and empresses. So basically, get out there and fight. And so, like any a good husband, he does what his wife says and heads out there and actually is able to put down the riots. Now, despite the fact that much of Constantinople was burnt to the ground, Justinian and Theodora saw it as a way to basically rebuild the city in their own image. And so you have the kind of the rebuilding of Constantinople with kind of the introduction of the Hagia Sophia. Now, this is the main cathedral in the city. Now, I don't have a picture of it for some reason, but I will post it on the announcements on Blackboard. But again, the Hagia Sophia, kind of the centerpiece of this massive reconstruction project of Constantinople. And then in addition, kind of the most ambitious project is the reunification of the Roman Empire. It's important to note that the Roman Empire, the East Roman Empire, saw the West as only temporarily lost. In other words, they saw it as their duty, their obligation to reunite the empire once again. Yes, the Hagia Sophia was the cathedral. Later on, it was turned into a mosque. Now it's a museum, if I'm not mistaken. And so you have you have Justinian sending his armies westward, and for quite some time actually is relatively successful in reunifying much, not all, much of the Roman Empire. Now, unfortunately, the Byzantine Empire does not have the resources of manpower to hold this. And so most of these gains, the reconquest of Italy, the conquest of Spain, the conquest of southern France, would pretty much be wiped out within 50 years of these conquests. So again, despite Justinian the Great's attempt to kind of reunify the Western Empire, it didn't amount to much. Now, the Sassanids, meanwhile, the Sassanids took advantage of the weakness of the Roman Empire and began to expand westward. Now, the first Shahanshah of the Sassanid Empire is this man, Khosrow the First. Now, Khosrow is, again, a Zoroastrian priest who's also noble, and he's the one who kind of leads a rebellion against the previous imperial dynasty. If y'all remember, it was the Parthians, and rebuilds this Sassanid dynasty. Remember, the thing I need you to remember about the Sassanids is they're basically the Achaemenids, Cyrus's empire reborn. Again, that's the goal of this particular dynasty, is to revive the glory of Cyrus's empire. And so you have Khosrow kind of, again, developing this kind of this large empire with the help of military, with the help of a very powerful military. Now, I'm going to turn your attention to this particular word here, decans. Now, a decan is a small military landowner. So what Khosrow does as emperor, one of the Shahanshah, is he basically begins seizing land from wealthy landowners. He begins seizing land from wealthy landowners and distributing it among military officers. The goal is to pretty much provide this land for veterans. The hope is to maintain the loyalty and support of the military. And so again, these decans are basically, think of them like part-time governors, part-time military officers. They're responsible for redistributing land to those who need it, particularly those who serve or have served in the Sassanid military. Jonathan, the spelling is, remember, the Achaemenids are the dynasty of Cyrus, of Darius, of Xerxes, who we talked about in class a few weeks ago. And so again, the Sassanids succeed in expanding their empire and remain incredibly formidable for the next few hundred years. Now, I think we really talked about Zoroastrianism, but I'm struggling to remember just how much detail I went into it. Did I really talk about Zoroastrianism detail in terms of its gods, in terms of its importance? Well, it's important to get a refresher anyway. So for those of you, so again, just a reminder, Zoroastrianism may be the oldest monotheistic religion in history. All right. So it starts with its prophet Zarathustra. Now, according to tradition, Zarathustra lived somewhere in what is now Central Asia, maybe Iran, maybe Afghanistan, maybe Kazakhstan, in that area of Central Asia. And supposedly he, was an everyday guy who began having nightmares. He would struggle, he would, have trouble sleeping, and oftentimes would just kind of pass the nights wandering around his village. And until one day he is kind of met by this power, this energy, and it was the god Ahura Mazda. Right? So Ahura Mazda approaches Zarathustra and tells him that he has chosen Zarathustra as his prophet. All right, and so Zarathustra dedicates the rest of his life in preaching the word of Ahura Mazda. Now, what this religion is the foundation of is, again, that Ahura Mazda is the god of everything, is the god. He represents everything pure and just and right, and just this, and he is the creator of heaven and earth, right? And so nevertheless, despite the fact that he is the god, he also has a parallel opposite, right? If Ahura Mazda represents everything good and just, Angra Mainyu represents everything the opposite of that. He represents everything evil, dark, a destroyer. Now, now it is considered a monotheistic religion because no one worships Angra Mainyu. Everyone worships Ahura Mazda, right? But even then, it is what we call a dualistic religion. Very good, Jonathan. Now, what this means is that you have a duality, good and evil. All right. Now, by this definition, is Christianity a dualistic religion? No, it's not. It's not a dualistic religion. Now, what this means is that Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, according to Zarathustra, are in a constant battle with each other for supremacy, for the souls of everyone, right? And so they're equally powerful. In Christianity, is the devil, right, who is kind of the Christian version of Angra Mainyu, is he just as powerful as God? Yeah, no. According to Christian theology, Satan, whatever you want to call him, is a fallen angel. He is not the equivalent of God. All right, and so Christianity is not a dualistic religion. All right, and so um, now, according to Zarathustra, at some point in time in the future, God, Ahura Mazda, I said God, but yeah, um, Ahura Mazda will eventually defeat Angra Mainyu in an apocalyptic battle. All right, at the end of the world, Ahura Mazda will defeat Angra Mainyu and will come down from the heavens to judge both the living and the dead. And those who are fair, who are just, who are righteous, will enter into paradise, and those who are not will be cast into oblivion. Sounds somewhat familiar, correct? Yeah, very good. All right, we'll talk about its legacy later on. But again, what I want to emphasize is this issue of the concept of Ahura Mazda. Now, I am going to, just before I forget, very quickly take attendance, guys, and we'll begin. We'll again continue on with the lecture in just a minute. So bear with me, please. Alex C, are you Alexandria Cordova? Okay. I'm listening, guys. Just give me one more second. Okay. So I will. So I see a couple of questions. So just we'll talk about Taoism or Taoism in a little while in the next couple of chapters. But just FYI, Taoism can be considered one of both. You could be a Taoist as a religion, but you also can see it as a philosophy. Um, Zarathustra is, if the one you're referring to, is a topic of Nietzsche's work. But it's, and again, there's still debate. We can't definitively prove whether or not Zarathustra was a lot as an actual person because we don't really know when he lived. Some people say that he was, 1,500 years ago. Some people say 7,000 years ago. We really have no idea. So we can't historically actually definitively prove that Zarathustra was actually a person. Um, and so the concept of Zarathustra. So again, Zarathustra is not necessarily is the founder of this religion. He is considered to be the founder, but he is not a holy individual. Far from it. He's actually just a prophet, someone who Ahura Mazda chose to spread his message. Now, um, so Zarathustra, as I mentioned this before, no, well, not really, because again, Jesus, according to Christianity, was the Son of God. Zarathustra is not. Zarathustra is just an individual. So, Ahura Mazda itself, I'm sorry, Zarathustra himself, again, in this religion, uh, uh, begins kind of preaching these hymns and these stories and these passages, and eventually they're all compiled into an organization. Into, think of it like a long chant, which is known as the Avesta. Remember, the Avesta are the sacred prayers of the Zoroastrians, right? And so these Avestas are the ones that I mentioned earlier, are passed down from generation to generation of priests. And so this is what we're talking about here. Now, its legacy, needless to say, is incredibly important because, just to kind of lay it all out there, without this religion, there is no Judaism, there is no Christianity, there is no Islam. If y'all remember me telling you, during the Babylonian captivity, the Jews that were in exile in Babylon were exposed to Zoroastrianism. By the time that they got to Babylon, Zoroastrianism was already a very popular religion there. And all of a sudden, that idea of a uncompromising faith in God, that the trials and difficulties that people face is just part of the test, right? This is incorporated into Judaism, right? This is incorporated into the faith. So remember, at the time, Judaism was very much like, yeah, there, Yahweh's cool, but there's other gods, but we'll just focus on Yahweh. That stops. Now there is no God but Yahweh. There is no God but God. And this uncompromising monotheism will continue on to Christianity and onto Islam. I remember the idea of a final apocalyptic battle between good and evil. The idea of the judgment of the living and the dead. All of these things come from Zoroastrianism. So again, its legacy is without Zoroastrianism, there is no what we call Abrahamic religion. Spelling. Okay. So one thing I want to mention also as well is a very unique aspect of this religion. This is the last thing I'll mention about Zoroastrianism is its interpretation of materialism. Now, as we have seen in other religions, particularly in India, you have this emphasis on aestheticism. If you remember this process of aestheticism, this idea of a minimal lifestyle, where you don't have a lot of possessions, and that possessions, kind of bind you to this world. Well, Zoroastrianism doesn't really see it that way. Zoroastrianism sees this world and its pleasures, whether it's good food or a nice house or even a sex, as gifts. And remember, think about it logically. If Ahura Mazda, who is the god of everything good and just, created this world, then isn't this world good and just? So you do have this embracing of materialism that yes, you should indulge yourself in good food and in sexual pleasure and just basically life, because again, this is considered to be a blessing as opposed to being a curse. Now, it's not to say to lead a hedonistic lifestyle where that's all you do is just try to seek pleasure. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. But in other words, be grateful for the pleasures that you obtain, whether it's food or whether it's companionship, et cetera, because again, according to Zoroastrianism, these are blessings. Now, as I mentioned before, when during the Babylonian captivity, you have this transformation of Judaism into a strict monotheistic faith. And you begin to see it very, very much kind of developing rather quickly. Even the texts that were written during the Babylonian captivity, for example, like the book of Daniel, even the book of Isaiah and Elijah, you begin to see this change. Now, if you notice this phrase here, Deutero-Isaiah. Now, what this refers to is that within the book of Isaiah, in the Old Testament, you have this shift in the middle of it. What we believe happened is that the book of Isaiah was actually written right before the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem. And it was kind of picked up, it was kind of, started again during the Babylonian captivity, because the first half of it, kind of has that old school, Yahweh, yeah, there's other gods, but no. And all of a sudden, it changes in the middle of the book to, no, there's only one God but God. So we call this theory that the book itself was written halfway before the Babylonian captivity and then during the Babylonian captivity as Deutero-Isaiah. Now, as I mentioned before, when Cyrus conquered Babylon, he sent the Jews home and gave them permission to rebuild their temple. Right? And he actually gave them material and funds to do so. So when they came back to Jerusalem, the first thing they did was rebuild the temple. But again, remember, this is a very different form of religion, where all of a sudden now it is very centralized, where all of a sudden the Jewish faith is central and focused on the Temple of David in Jerusalem, right? And so this temple will be the main focus of Judaism until the Romans destroy it in 70 CE. Now, I'm going to, just for the sake of time, I'm going to briefly skip over Greek philosophy at the moment, but I will try to get back to that eventually before the chapter break. Now, continue with the theory of Judaism. Now, like I mentioned before, when when Alexander, establishes this Greek empire, you begin to see the spread of Hellenism. It also affects the Jews as well. You have many, especially those in the elite upper classes of Jewish society, adopting Hellenistic ways of life. They begin speaking Greek. They begin adopting Greek concepts. They become in many ways Greek. But for many others, this is not necessarily a positive, right? Many Jews, especially those in the lower classes, saw the upper classes converting into becoming Greek as almost like selling out in a way. And so you do have a lot of resentment to Hellenism, but eventually this increases, especially during the time of the Seleucids. Now, if you all remember, the Seleucids were the ruling dynasty of Greeks ruling much of the Persian Empire after the death of Alexander. Now, the Seleucid emperors, the Seleucid Shahs, as they call themselves, over time became more and more self-absorbed. Basically, they fell under the belief that they were basically gods walking the earth. And so eventually, one of the Seleucid Shahs ordered that a statue be built of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem. So remember, keep in mind that this is supposed to be a sacred ground for only Yahweh, for only the God of the Jews. And so, needless to say, this results in a rebellion, right? Where for the first time in almost 400 years, Israel is liberated from foreign occupation, right? And is ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty from 140 to 37. For those of you who are familiar with biblical literature, this is the Hasmonean dynasty are from the Maccabees. I had a hard time remembering it for a second. Now, despite the fact that the focus of Jewish religion is on the Grand Temple, you also have emphasis on the synagogues, right, where local rabbis would, responsible for carrying out ceremonial events, et cetera, et cetera. So while the Grand Temple is still the most important aspect of Jewish society, you do have other local religious houses that are built throughout Israel. Now, eventually what happens, however, is that the Hasmonean dynasty falls into civil war. And one of the competing factions of the dynasty decides it'd be a good idea to invite the Romans, because the Romans would be good allies, so they will help us win this war. We will, gain control of this household of Israel, and then the Romans will go home. Yeah, it's not that simple. The Romans never go home. And so eventually, just as I mentioned, the Romans put down the civil war, but then they also basically refused to leave. And eventually, Israel becomes a Roman province of Judea. Now, during this period of time, with Roman occupation, the Jewish faith becomes more and more apocalyptic. In other words, the belief that the end time, the time when a Messiah will come and liberate the Jews from Roman occupation, will, that it's just around the corner, that it can happen at any point in time. And so this emphasis on the Messiah is what becomes more and more emphasized during this period of Roman occupation. Now, unfortunately, I have run out of time. Like I said, I try to keep the time frame as much as possible.